they would become a major problem and a stumbling block for the children of Israel. The conquest of Canaan will unfortunately remain incomplete, not only during the time of the judges, but also the time of the king. And frankly, it is incomplete to this day. The total conquest of Canaan will be completed one day by our Lord and Savior Jesus, who will finally rid the land of those who do not belong as he takes his throne at the end of the tribulation and rules for 1,000 years. Until then, Israel continues to experience the repercussions of their disobedience, even today, as they failed to appropriate all that God had promised. So, after receiving this message from the angel of the Lord, they wept in a place called Bochim, which was near Gilgal, and soon after, Joshua died in the territory of his inheritance. After the death of Joshua and all the elders who ruled under Joshua, a generation arose that had little regard for anything that their forefathers had done. And I believe they certainly knew Joshua and Moses and the Red Sea crossing and the wilderness wanderings, but those events were for dusty old history books. Their new reality didn't involve war, but rather how to get along in a 13th century BC world. Their new reality didn't involve, the Canaanites were here to stay was their new reality. And honestly, they probably thought, Jim and Mary, these Canaanites are swell people, not really much unlike us in a lot of ways. Tolerance, No, that's okay. Do I have a number? All right. Let me start. Yeah, a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord. And most scholars, they with these appearances, the angel of the Lord appeared to Abraham. When the angel of the Lord is used, it's always I in the first person. Now, if we know if it's a run-of-the-mill angel, it's thus saith the Lord. There is always a precursor to what that angel says. It's really clear by the context of the verses that it's a run-of-the-mill angel rather than the angel of the Lord or God himself. When it's God himself, it's I. And so we know that this is the Lord speaking. So they had a problem. This new generation. The new reality didn't involve war, but rather how to get along this 13th century BC world. The Canaanites were here to stay, so this was the new reality. And honestly, Jim and Mary, the Canaanites are swell people, not unlike us, really. Tolerance and compromise were the ideals of the day. We've talked about that in the past. This came at a cost because soon they were steeped in idolatry, breaking faith with their God, caught up in syncretism. A few more generations, and they looked nothing like the people that crossed the Jordan River with Joshua just a century before. So God allowed invaders to oppress Israel, to punish them for their idolatry until they were brought back to their God and cried out to Jehovah. Then God would raise a shofet to deliver the people from this oppression. And after this deliverance, God would provide peace during the life of the judge. But after he died, they would go back to their idolatry, and the cycles of sin continues. Now, we finished last week by going over the 3 reasons why God allowed the Canaanites to stay in the land. Number 1, to discipline Israel for not following his direct instructions and for worshiping other gods. Number 2, to test Israel's loyalty. And number 3, to teach Israel how to defend itself. Now, I explained last week that I believe verse 2 in chapter 3 does not indicate that God's only reason here was simply to teach the people warcraft. although it was his intention to give them training so they could defend themselves. But he was also training them for holy war. Now, I hesitate to use that term because holy war, we think of jihad. We think of what the Muslims use and others, terrorists use nowadays, and they call it holy war. This is not what I'm speaking about here. Holy war was initiated and led by God with the purpose of ridding the land of evil. It does not involve re-education or peace treaties, but total eradication and destruction. Ultimately, God was going to use war to teach the people about himself. Because as God's holy warriors, what we learn about our God is what matters. For us today, we are forced, and there's going to come a time where we're definitely going to be forced, almost on a daily basis, to learn the art of spiritual warfare, which begins with prayer and often ends with physical acts, volitional decisions, dangerous works, and at times great personal sacrifice. The first generation after Joshua chose peace, tolerance, and compromise. But God told Israel this, try as they might, he will cause this peace to fail. And God had an endless supply of Canaanites to accomplish his purpose. So let's turn in our Bibles to Judges chapter 3. Any questions over the introduction? Anything we've gone over so far before we start? Yeah, a lot of the things that went on there, like looking in a mirror, history repeating itself. Great lessons for us. No, we don't. Like them, lots of times we're hard of hearing. Right. And you think about it today. Land for peace, peace, tolerance, and compromise. As we ask Israel to give up more of their own land just for peace, because peace is good. I mean, it's a good word. Tolerance is a good word. And certainly masquerading as a good word in certain cases is bad, right? In this case, peace and tolerance was what God called for. But you can see that after fighting so many years under Joshua, that's exactly what they did. They made peace treaties. After a while, it just wasn't that important anymore. And they didn't appropriate all God had for them. And, you know, like I mentioned, that decision affects Israel today. And that this land will never be conquered until the Lord comes back and conquers it himself, right? So there's repercussions to this disobedience. Peace and tolerance, lots of times are really good words, but in this case, it was disobedience. Now, we're going to start tonight by reading just the first 6 verses. So follow along with me, just the first 6. Now, these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generation of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived in Mount Lebanon and Mount Baal-Hermon, as far as Lebo-Hamath. They were for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. Now, in verse 1 and 4, the Lord states that the following nations remained for Israel's testing. The sense of this word is like a judicial trial or proving, okay? So they were either going to remain faithful, thus receiving in some sense an acquittal, or in this acquittal, I should say, and given peace, right? Or a conviction before God's holy throne room. And this would bring about God's discipline using the nations that we're going to look at next. So that word testing is in a judicial sense. They were on trial during the time of the judges. Now, God left nations that remained. So I thought it would be beneficial tonight to just look a little bit into the background of the nations that remain, so that when we do read them and study them, they're not such a mystery to us. Like, who are we talking about here? So we have a little bit of a better understanding. And obviously, the article that I gave you could also read as well for further understanding. Okay, so number one, the five lord or kings of the Philistines. The Philistines lived along the southern seacoast of the land, and were a union of 5 city-states, each having a lord or a king who ruled each city. The cities they controlled were Ekron, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza, which were located in Judah's territory, and their northern border sometimes extended into Dan's territory. So Judah and Dan really basically had the most trouble with the Philistines. Now, remember in chapter 1, verse 18, it says that Judah took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, 3 out of these 5 city-states. So the conclusion is that Judah eventually lost these three cities back to the Philistines sometime during the Judges. So they were not able to hold these 3 cities. The Philistines took them back. So those are the vaunted Philistines. The Canaanites. The Canaanites are a general designation for all the people who settled the promised land after the flood. Okay? So Noah's son Ham had 4 sons: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Cush settled the area south of the land and eventually settled in Nubia, which is an area south of Egypt. If you hit Egypt and just continue further south, this is the modern-day Sudan, is what that is. Mizraim settled the area of Egypt itself. Actually, Egypt was also called Mizraim by the Hebrews. So that is that area of Egypt. Put settled an area west of Egypt. So you go down to northern Africa, hit Egypt, and go west, and you're going to get the area that Put settled in northern Africa. It's more modern-day Libya, in and around that area. Canaan settled the Promised Land area. But not all the people who were in the Promised Land were actually descendants of Canaan. It's kind of what I'm getting at. Not unlike our country, where everyone is generally designated as Americans, but we have many different people who settled in our land. Or another example, with somebody from Georgia, we might call them a Southerner. Right, because they're in. It just designates the area of Canaan. The point is that Canaanite usually is a description of all the different people who ended up settling this area. Not all Canaanites are ethnically related to Canaan, the son of Ham, although a lot of them really are. Most of them are, actually. So when Judges says that Israel followed after Canaanite gods, it could mean the Canaanite gods and customs, or the Amorite gods and their customs, or the Jebusite gods or customs, and so on and so forth. Sometimes the Canaanite is broadly just all the people who existed in this land area. And sometimes specifically it's descendants of Canaan. Right on the map there, I got Put up there, and actually it says Egypt. Can anybody see Egypt? I don't know if you can see that. It shouldn't say Egypt. I wish that map would have said Mizraim. Yeah, but that's where the son of Ham settled. Basically, that's the nations. That's as they separated the sons of Noah. That's kind of basically where they went. So a little bit to the north, that's where Japheth went. That's kind of Europe in that area. Okay, the son of Ham, the Canaan, went south. Cush and Put, they all went south, and it just shows you where they went. So Ham's descendants definitely went all south. Shem, that's where Abraham was a Shemite. That's the orange. And they settled in the Arabian area. So I just wanted to give you an idea of that. We're going to come back to that. The Sidonians were a city-state along the northern seacoast. So whereas the Philistines were all the way to the south, they were all the way to the north. They were a very powerful people who were never driven out by Asher. They were actually, that land was given to Asher, but Asher never conquered the Sidonians, and their territory never extended that far north. You look at a map of Israel during the time of the judges, and you'll see Asher comes a little short of Sidon. But read chapter 1, and they were given that territory. So the Sidonians were very powerful, a city-state right along the sea, and they were never conquered. The Hivites were people who settled the northern hill country. Now, not much else is known about them except the Gibeonites during the time of Joshua. If you go back, they tricked Joshua. They came wearing all those dirty clothing, the dusty clothing, and said, we're from a faraway land. We traveled here. We're not from this land. Can we make a peace treaty with you? And Joshua said, sure. And then they found out that they were from that area. So the Hivites actually were in central Israel for a little while, and the Gibeonites were Hivites. They were there. But apparently they moved north at some point in time between the time of Joshua and Judges. So you feel that if you see a map, they're up north, the Hivites. The Amorites. The Amorites were ancient people who were actually Canaanites. They were ethnically Canaanites because they were listed as descended from Canaan in Genesis chapter 10. They were in different parts of the land, but were mentioned as the ones who drove Dan into the hill country of their territory. And we're going to go over Dan probably at the end of the study because it's in the last chapters. But we know that Dan moved, and I mentioned that before. So the Amorites were the ones that drove Dan out into the hills. They could not defeat the Amorites that lived in Dan's territory. So they were kind of scattered around there. That's the Amorites. The Hittites were descendants of Heth, which was Canaan's second son. And they lived in the hill country around Hebron. We already studied about them. We did the Hittites. They were kind of in and around where Caleb conquered. Abraham buried Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, the cave that was bought by a Hittite. If you remember the story of Abraham buying that cave, the man he bought it from was a Hittite. And Uriah, who Bathsheba's husband, was a Hittite. He was one of David's mighty men. So Uriah was a Hittite by nationality. They also settled the areas of northern Syria and Turkey. Actually, most of the Hittites' kingdom was up there to the far north as well. The Perizzites, nothing really is known about these people. The Perizzites, and I don't have the Girgashites here. You'll see them on your list. Really not much is known, but that they might be a general designation, not as like a people group, but people who were hill people, almost like we would call hillbillies. They're not a nationality at all, but they're people that were in the hills. So it's anybody's best guess who they really were. But they thought that they were pretty much hill people, and that was a designation for all the people in the land that were up in the hills, especially to the south. The Jebusites were a mountain tribe living in and around Jerusalem, descended from Canaan's third son, Jebus. David bought the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. Okay, so that was located on Mount Moriah. So he was a famous Jebusite. All right. Then the threshing floor of Ornan became what? Anybody remember? Temple. What's the temple? Which part of the temple?
The Holy of Holies, right?
Holy of Holies. Spot on. Okay, so that was a Jebusite, Ornan. All right. David bought that threshing floor, and tradition says that threshing floor was where the Holy of Holies was placed, right on Mount Moriah. Let's read verses 7 through 11 together, and let's get to our first judge. Sure. Canaan was the son of Ham. I must not have been, I probably wasn't clear. We skipped through that. Yes. Remember that Ham, Noah's son, had 4 children. Cush, Put, Mizraim, and Canaan. Noah had 3 sons, one of them Ham. Remember Ham? Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham had 4 sons. One was Cush. The other one was Put. And they established like Sudan and Libya. Mizraim he settled in Egypt. So Egyptians are descended from Ham, right? And Canaan was the 4th son, and he settled the Promised Land. Okay, so Canaan is Noah's grandson. Right? And some of the other tribes that I was going over, and like you can read about them as well, were some of Canaan's sons. So they were great-grandchildren of Noah. You can go and you can study these maps, the nations, how they spread out. Genesis chapter 10, and look at them. It's very, very interesting stuff. That's stuff that I like. I'm a geek. I like looking at all those things. So you can look and see how the nations kind of spread out from Ham, Shem, and Japheth and where they went. And their biblical names. Really, really neat stuff. I just wanted to skim because I'm going to make a point about Cush in a little bit, actually in this first part. All the Israelis are Shemites. They're descendants of Shem, Noah's son Shem, not Ham. The Arab nations are from Ham, a lot of them. So you know how we say anti-Semitism? It's a corruption, and it should be they're Shemites, but they became known as Semites. It's just a corruption in the translation of the language. So when you say anti-Semitism, it should be anti-Shemitism, because they're all of Abraham's seed. They're all Shemites. Ham is another one. Ham is his brother. Japheth. Shem. They're Shemites or Semites. I think anti-Semitism comes from Shemites, Shemitism. It should be anti-Shemitism. All right? It's a lot, and I don't want you to focus on, just kind of get the basic idea of where they came from, where these people came from as they settled the land, and it gives you a little better as we go through these. I remember who the Amorites were and the Hivites and all that. Need help. Okay, let's look at our first judge. Starting in verse 7, just going to read 5 verses here. Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. When the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. When he went out to war, the Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, something like that, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so he prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. Say that 3 times fast. Then the land had rest for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So, Israel, and more specifically the tribe of Judah, served a king by the name of Cushan Rishathaim. For 8 years, they were under this oppression. Now, his name means doubly wicked Cushite. Now, how many of you think that this was his real name? Right? Unless he was really proud of his wickedness, this was a moniker given to him by the Hebrews. And I was thinking to myself, maybe he was really proud of that. If you guys disobey me, the doubly wicked Cushite will crush you like a twig. Probably. This is probably given him to him by by probably the tribe of Judah itself. I mean, I wonder also if we maybe we have this used by the tribe of Judah, maybe for a bedtime story. You know, when the kids refuse to go to bed early. If you don't go to bed, we're going to get the doubly wicked Cushite to get you. So, yes. Coming in and out? Yeah, there we go. So, this is a moniker given to him by the Hebrews, but we do get a hint of his ethnicity. Not in all the way, I got it. Yeah. So we do get a hint of his ethnicity. He was a Cushite. That's why I kind of went over that a little earlier. Cush being the sons of Ham, who settled the area south of the Holy Land. Now, it says that he was the king of Mesopotamia, or in some of your versions, it's going to say Aram. So, Aram and Mesopotamia is basically the same. It's just modern-day Syria. So here's my question. I don't know if you picked up on this. What was the king of Aram, or Mesopotamia, doing traveling all the way south to pester Judah while leaving the northern tribes in peace? Did anybody pick up on that? So if you go north of the Holy Land, all the way into Syria, and it's pretty far up there, Aram is pretty far out of the Holy Land. So we have something that doesn't make sense in this chapter.
It's the trade route, right?
It is the trade route. But my question would be, why Judah? Why Othniel? Why not bother Asher, who is much closer? Those in the north. Now, there are people, and I've seen the maps, who put Othniel and they stick him right up north. They put his judgeship right up in Asher and Naphtali. But he was from Judah. If this is the case, just so I'm saying, this is the only case where there is no bordering nation that attacks Israel or oppresses Israel in the time of the judges. So if it is Mesopotamia, this is the only case where we have some king coming from so far away to come through. Of course, we have like Assyria. We have Babylon when they're at the height of their power, traveling large, miles, large amounts of land during their empires. But this is a single king who comes down here. So I do have at least an explanation that possibly could be for this. So usually a nation subjugates a neighboring country for very specific reasons like food supplies or precious metals or natural resources. This was true of all other invasions or invaders in the book of Judges. So my question again is, what was a Cushite doing so far north? This is a case where I'm going to give you a theory, but I cannot be too dogmatic about it. Okay? Jewish scholars have long known that the words of Aram and Edom are often transposed in the Bible. Remember that there are no vowels in Hebrew. So Aram, if you took the two A's out, is just RM, just two Hebrew letters. Everybody got it? It's a resh and a mem. And you see a resh up there. I spelled it with a Y. I gave it a little extra. It's not pronounced resh. It's a resh with a Y. So that's a resh, mem. So an M is mem. Edom, drop the E and the O, and you have DM. So you have Dalet mem. A resh and a Dalet look nearly identical. Therefore, they were a regular copyist error. And it's been known to have some copyist errors in some of the names. So if you look up there, look at the Dalet and look at the Resh, and you can see where there may be some confusion in certain passages. Now, this does not change anything scripturally. It doesn't change the doctrine. It's just sometimes there's copyist errors in certain numbers, in certain texts. It doesn't have anything to do or change any of the doctrines that we believe. It doesn't change the story in any way. I'm offering it up as a suggestion that there could have been a copyist error, so this Cushite may have been an Edomite king rather than an Aramean king, which puts his kingdom just south and adjacent to Judah. So Edom borders Judah to the south. So it seems to make a little bit more sense that Cushan Rishathaim was an Edomite rather than an Aramean. So either way, it does not matter for the text. God raised up Othniel, Caleb's brother, after 8 years of oppression to deliver the southern tribes. He was probably the tribal leader of Judah at this time by marriage. So you remember that he married Caleb's daughter. So he married into tribal leadership. So she was probably a very wonderful person and a very beautiful girl, but there may have been more to that marriage than just he loved Aksa. Othniel was given special ability by God to perform all the duties that the Lord set out for him. As a shofet, as the Spirit came upon him. Now, this is different language than what is described in the New Testament. In the New Testament, the contrast is this is the permanent indwelling of the Holy Spirit in all the believers after Pentecost. Okay? So certain leaders, and David himself, the Spirit came upon them to give them power to perform the duties that they were going to perform for the Lord, in this case, a shofet. So this is definitely different than the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, which is permanent for us, the believers. So you're going to see this where the Spirit comes upon him. Now, after his victorious campaign, the Lord gave the southern tribes rest for 40 years until Othniel died. Any questions about our first judge? Yeah, just to give this to you as we go through these things, you know I'm going to use language like I cannot be dogmatic. Sometimes I use other words just to get you to understand that we're dealing in a lot of details here. And so there's some things that I cannot be certain of. And same thing when I do my research. There's good historians that are out there that, they take their best guess as well. But what we got to do is take out what we know is absolutely true about verses 7 through 11. And the rest we can just speculate for a little bit of fun. It's kind of what I did with this. Could this be the king of Mesopotamia and we could be totally wrong? Absolutely. Could it make perfect sense that maybe there was a real good reason why this king came all the way from the north to come to the south? Yeah, sure. The people of the time may have known exactly why he came all the way south. So, like I said, we're worried about this, what we can really know exactly, in the scripture. All right? All right, we're going to read next section, verses 12 to 30. We got our second judge. Okay, follow along with me, verses 12 to 30. You sure there's no other questions before we move on?
Was there a reason why Othniel was chosen?
He was chosen because his tribe was being oppressed. That's why, and it's important to go along with what we know in studying the book. So let me actually further describe, what kind of I was talking about when I ended there. So you're a scholar, you're studying the book of Judges. You understand, you read, and you realize that it makes no sense that the king of Mesopotamia comes all the way down into Judah. So your correction to that is to take Othniel and say, well, he ruled all, it says he ruled all of Israel, and Judah's never mentioned, so we're going to pluck him and we're going to put him up north. So let's use what we know. We know that these tribes were pretty divided. They had a lot of problems in the time of Joshua. So it makes no sense to me to assume, because I have such a hard time believing why this king came all the way up there, that the tribes of Asher and Naphtali would have invited Othniel, a Judean, to come all the way up to judge them, to help them from their oppression. We see division more likely in the book of, especially towards the end of Joshua and into the Judges, than unity. So I find it really hard to believe, but you know what? That's what people do. I'm going to stick Othniel all the way up here. He had to judge the north because that's the only part of Israel that makes sense. And because it doesn't say Judah, that's where he's going to be. Now, see, all of the judges judged their tribe, plus some other tribes that came to their rescue. Gideon. And when he called tribes, there was more than one tribe. He led a group of tribes, but he judged his own tribe and that area. So I would say that Othniel, basically his judgeship was Judah, maybe Dan, maybe a little bit of Benjamin. It was the whole southern area. But he didn't judge Asher. He wasn't the judge of Asher. And we're going to see that the Lord uses these oppressors to affect different parts of Israel, not all at one time. Never is a judge over all of Israel. If that's the case, and that's why the author does not say Judah or does not mention Judah here, then I would be wrong. And you can make fun of me for all eternity. But the sense of this is that this is the tribe of Judah. And for whatever reason, I'm going to say that I personally believe this is a king of Edom because it's a neighboring area. It makes more sense to me. But my second thought is that Mesopotamia, that king came all the way down. I would not go the route of sticking Othniel out of his tribe into the north and going against all common sense.
Yeah,
Everybody got it?
I think, because that's where Caleb also fought, with the sons of Anak down south in the Negev, it says. Right, so it's, Othniel's going to be in that same region. You've got to find a king that's going to come
But more than likely, he is the tribal leader. He took
Right.
Caleb's place after marrying Aksa.
Right.
Well, there's no reason logically why a tribal leader would leave his tribe to judge Asher.
No.
Because I can't contemplate why this king came from Mesopotamia. So we can get into all kinds of things. Let's stick to, and like I said, whenever we do these things, it's for fun. I like to use a little bit, and then we learned a little bit about a Dalet and a Resh and what they're like. And look, copyist errors occurred. Some of the numbers don't match up.
Well, I think
It's
one
nothing
thing-
for us to get alarmed about,
The
right?
fact that he's a Cushite, he's from Sudan, where eventually will be Sudan. That southern trade route might be the reason why he came against, the southern part of it.
Right. I didn't bring this up because I did read that it's just too much information, that there are those scholars that believe that the Cushites settled southern Arabia before finally moving all the way down, or for this time they were more than likely in southern Arabia, like where the Midianites were, and and had some areas there or pockets of their people before they eventually just went down that Africa. I mean, some of it we could just, it just seems to make sense to me. This is an Edomite, and this is a more likely just a copyist error. But like I said, it doesn't change what God was doing, how he works, and anything that we learn moving forward. Well, usually you're fighting a neighboring country or king because they're trying to take something. They're trying to take your resources. They're trying to take your land. So if you're an Edomite, you're going to have a problem with Judah, the tribe, not with Asher, because they're bordering your land. Anyway, like I said, can't be too dogmatic about anything, so you can just have a lot of fun with it. So that's what we know. What we know is true from that passage. As long as I'm making myself clear about that, that's the important thing. Okay, let's see what happens to Ehud. Verse 12. Now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and he went and defeated Israel. And they possessed the city of palm trees. The sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man, and it came about when he had finished presenting the tribute that he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence. And all who attended him left. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. Ehud stretched out his left hand and took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. And when he had gone out, his servants came and looked, and behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. And they said, he is only relieving himself in the cool room. And they waited until they became anxious. But behold, he did not open the doors of the roof chamber. Therefore they took the key and opened them, and behold, their master had fallen to the floor dead. Now he had escaped while they were delaying, and he passed by the idols and escaped to Serah. It came about when he had arrived that he blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was in front of them. And he said to them, pursue them, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hands. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross. And they struck down at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. Long time. Now, verses 12 to 14 explain that Israel fell into idolatry, and God strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, to punish them for 18 years. It took them 18 years to understand that they not only were doing wrong, but that the God of their fathers was their only way out of this terrible situation. And I explained to you earlier when we were studying, it took some parts of this country a very, very long time to get it, right? So unlike Judah, this area, it took them 18 years to kind of understand what was going on here. Now Eglon used 2 other people groups, the Ammonites and the Amalekites. The Amalekites were hated enemies of Israel, and they were a picture of sin themselves. And he used these 2 to help them defeat Israel. So in verse 15, after Israel finally cried out for help, the Lord remained faithful and compassionate as he always does. Faithful. He raised up Ehud from the tribe of Benjamin, which means that the central tribes were the ones being oppressed at this time. Probably not Judah, and probably not Asher and Naphtali and Issachar up north. So this Shophet had a very interesting feature. He was left-handed. Being left-handed was so rare at this time that left-handed people were usually described as being bound up in the right hand. In other words, left-handed people were that way because they had a defect in their right hand. Right. So it does not say in this passage that he's left-handed. It said he's bound up in the right hand. So they don't even say left-handed. They actually say bound up in the right hand. So it was thought of as a defect if you used your left hand. But if we look at a few other passages of Scripture, we realize that left-handedness was a recessive trait that ran among the Benjamites. Later on, we're going to study Judges 20:16. It describes 700 left-handed Benjamites who were so accurate with a sling that they could aim at a single hair and not miss. Also, in 1 Chronicles 12:2, notes that there's this group of Benjamites that helped David who were ambidextrous with a sling or a bow. They could use both hands equally. So he was one of these Benjamites, and it ran in this tribal lineage. So at the end of verse 15, we see that the reason Ehud was traveling to see Eglon was to give him tribute. Now, remember that I mentioned that there are always logical reasons for these invaders to oppress Israel. There's always a reason, right? So for Eglon, it seems to be money, personal wealth, natural resources. It was common during this time for a king to require a nation that he defeated to bring their riches, gold, silver, sometimes even flocks of animals. And we also notice that in this passage, he left a garrison in Israel to keep them in check. Right at the fords, he left some people. And he probably had some other soldiers from either a mix from his army, the Ammonites and the Amalekites, in Israel, in Benjamite territory, in their territory. So he left a garrison there. So we note that. So Ehud would have delivered these things right with a group of men. So that's why he's being sent by his tribe to give tribute for the central tribes. He's a representative. But he's traveling with a group because he's bringing a bunch of things with him. So there would have been a group of men to understand that that's what happened. Now, his route would have taken him past Gilgal and across the Jordan, and then he would have, after crossing the Jordan, went around the Dead Sea and went south into Moab. Now, that's Reuben's territory. We hear nothing from Reuben. I can almost guarantee Reuben probably didn't even really hold that territory. Probably Moab did, but I don't know. But he would have definitely traveled south to reach Moab. So it was a journey. So being moved or called by God at this point, Ehud made a plan. In verse 16, he made a sword, which is really more like a dagger. It was a cubit long, and it was tied to his right side. A sword would have been bulky. It would have stuck out. And usually it has a hilt, a cross piece, that would have stuck out. So it's apparent that this dagger that he made, about 18 inches long, maybe a foot long, they say that the word for cubit is a different word, Hebrew word, and it was more of a foot long, but he would have made the handle flat. So it would have sat really flat on his thigh. So this is what he does. He makes a dagger, he ties it to his right thigh, and it would have been well concealed under his cloak. You wouldn't have been able to see. Now, verses 17 through 19 explain that Ehud presented the tribute to Eglon, then left with the delivery party. Okay, so I know it's 17 through 19. You can get a little confusing if you're not careful and read it real carefully. All right, so let me just kind of go over that. He left with a delivery party. So he presented everything to Eglon. But his plan is his own. And if he would have come by himself, it would have raised suspicion. Not to mention he couldn't carry all the items. So he doesn't tell the party that nobody knows he's going to do this. Only he knows. So it says he leaves with the delivery party, and at the idols which were at Gilgal, he sent them away as he turned back to give his secret message to Eglon. Now, These idols, or some translations use the English word quarries. I think if you have the King James Version and some other versions, they use quarries. It comes from the Hebrew word pslim. I don't know how to say it. It begins with a P. Pslim. And this literally means sculptured statues. Now, what were sculptured statues doing in Gilgal? I think that the New American Standard translation of idols probably has it right. These sculptured statues, probably made out of stone. Okay, they were more likely statues of Moabite gods, and they were placed in Gilgal, probably near what? What objects that we know of are in Gilgal that were sacred to Israel? That's right, the 12 stones, right? The 12 memorial stones are in Gilgal. Gilgal had great spiritual significance to Israel. So another thing a foreign king may do to subjugate the people, to put them down, is to place objects and symbols of his God in order to remind those people that whose God was strongest. So it sounds like Eglon stuck these gods there by the memorial stones in a sacred place like Gilgal to show Israel who's boss and who's God's boss, basically. So Ehud, dismissing the delivery party, probably taking his last look at these Moabite idols, possibly strengthening his resolve, he journeyed back to Moab. Now, Eglon was sitting in his rooftop chamber, which would have been a cooler room because of the late afternoon breeze. That's where they got their breeze. So he would have been retiring there because of the coolness of the room itself. So after hearing that there's a secret message, he dismissed his people because, after all, Ehud was alone and weaponless to him. So he bought it, basically. So in verses 20 to 23, Ehud arose from his seat to give Eglon the message. Now, Eglon was a very big man, and his movements would have been slow, number one, right? Coupled with the fact that he thought Ehud was unarmed. And these two facts probably gave Ehud plenty of time to strike. But if you add the extra split second of confusion as Ehud reached across with his left hand to his right thigh in one fluid motion, it was a deadly move. So we can see how he got that dagger out quickly and how he got it into his stomach. Eglon had no clue that this man was armed. He ruled Israel for 18 years. Nobody's challenged his rule. So it must have came as a deadly surprise. So one fluid motion, a normal person, right? 99.9% of the people will be reaching right over here, right? This is where my sword goes. So I always go like this if I'm going to make a move. And he going like this would have confused that extra split second. So in case you didn't realize how that went, left hand goes to the right thigh, across, stab. And I won't go over the disgusting part of what happened. But that dagger sunk so far inside Eglon that Ehud didn't even bother to take it out. Now, after killing the king, Ehud locked the door as he went out. And yes, archaeology does support the fact that they had simple locking mechanisms at this time. So he would have been able to lock the door on the way out. Eglon's servants thought that the king was basically relieving himself. And that is why the door was locked, right? Covering your feet is another Hebrew euphemism for using the bathroom. So they would have given him his space. Eglon's servants, so they waited until they were sure something was wrong. So it was really basically uncomfortable. And when they unlocked the door, they found their king dead. So this delay, which was probably more than a few hours, was more than ample time for Ehud to escape. So in verse 26 through 30, as he passes those idols at Gilgal with grim satisfaction, whose God is more powerful now, Eglon, right? Ehud continued on to Sarah, which was an area that was a border between Benjamin and Ephraim, sat just north of Benjamin. And so Sarah would have been kind of right there at the border. And he sounded the shofar for his tribe, and possibly the tribe of Ephraim as well. And this, when you sound the shofar, this was a battle cry and a call to arms. The volunteers flooded in, and Ehud realized that now was the time to strike, because the death of the king created a temporary delay in leadership, maybe a little confusion, lack of communication. They were dealing with his death. So what he first did is he captured the fording points of the Jordan River. Now, this was to cut off the garrison and other Moabite soldiers, Ammonite or Amalekite soldiers. He was trying to cut off their escape route back into Moab. Also, to stop reinforcements, if they were really aware of what was going on in Israel, they would, by doing this, stop the reinforcements from coming in. So that's why he attacked the fording points. Now, they ended up killing 10,000 Moabites, and this slaughter broke the power of the Moabites over Israel. 10,000 Moabite soldiers, more than likely it was 10,000, were in the land. These were the garrisons, some others that were stationed in the land, did not allow them to cross back over into Israel. So, this broke Moabites' rule over Israel, and those central tribes had peace for 80 years, which means that our hero could not have been much older than what? 20. Proving once again that God can use any of his people despite their great faults, shortcomings, and weaknesses, like here, age and experience. There's no doubt that he was a very inexperienced soldier.
And left-handed, too.
And left-handed, right. This is, Ehud. So he had rest. He didn't die for another 80 years. He judged the central tribes here, the tribe of Benjamin specifically, and probably Ephraim, for 80 years, which puts him at either late teens or early 20s. Maybe 30 at the most, but probably not. So he was very young, and they had peace for a lot of years. Now, let's finish tonight by reading verse 31, and we're going to finish with our last shofet. Does anybody have any questions thus far? Anything that they got from the reading? Anything I haven't answered? Anything they want to comment about?
10,000 people. I coached basketball. You'd always play, if you didn't have a scouting report on the team, and there was a left-hander on the team, they probably in the first quarter, they would get a few buckets on you before you started realizing you got to play that left hand.
Right.
So it's always been like you didn't see it coming, and that's a key part of the story.
Right. I think it probably gave him that extra split second, so that King didn't know it was going to hit him. And the other thing, the reason why I had to be, and we don't think about this, is the king could have cried out. So it had to be so quick and swift that he died so quickly, so that he couldn't cry out. Imagine if he was bleeding to death for 30 minutes to an hour. He would have had a major issue trying to pull that dagger back out and try to drive that back in again. So I think it actually helped in the quickness of his death as well, so he couldn't alert anyone. Okay, so verse 31, last judge, good, moving forward. Last shofet of the chapter. It says, after him came Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. So we don't have much for Shamgar, right? We love Shamgar. That's a great name. Our last shofet in this chapter is named Shamgar. Not much is really given to us about him or his exploits, but there, I think, are a few things that we can deduce from this last verse. First, I want to talk about after him. After him does not mean that Shamgar's exploits happened after the death of Ehud, but rather after Ehud's military deliverance. So sometime after Ehud subdued the Moabites and retired as a judge, Shamgar, killed the 600 Philistines. So this means that Shamgar could have overlapped or been and probably more than likely was a contemporary of Ehud's, because he dealt with a different part of Israel. Now, obviously, we don't know a lot about the exploits to give all that information. But it seems to indicate in the beginning of the verse that, that after him does not mean after his death, because there is times where that's actually clear. It says after the death, then another judge arose. Anyway, so I just wanted to just at least clarify that. I think that Shamgar more than likely was a contemporary of Ehud's. Shamgar's exploits occurred after Ehud's exploits, but not after his death. So Shamgar, what does that name sound like to you? Shamgar. Some scholars think that's a Hurrian name. It sounds like a local Canaanite name, but certainly not Hebrew. Shamgar sounds nothing like a Hebrew name. To add to this mystery, Shamgar's clan is called Anath. Now, I'm going to tell you what Anath is. Anath is a Canaanite goddess of sex and war. It seems to me that Shamgar may have come from a mixed family. The mixed families we've been talking about, the mixed marriages. One we've been told during the first chapters of Judges already. We've been, it's been explained to us that the Hebrew men married the Canaanite daughters, and the Canaanite daughters married the Hebrew men, and vice versa, right? The Canaanites married their sons to Hebrew women, right? And so it worked both ways. So intermarriage occurred pretty early in the time of the Judges. So it seems to me that Shamgar may have come from one of these mixed families. His clan in particular may have been named in honor of this goddess. In Shamgar, we may see the terrible influence that the pagans had on Hebrew society, because the fact is Shamgar was a Hebrew. The other fact is that even though Shamgar would have never been picked for his Hebrew national kickball team because of his mixed heritage and terribly offensive name, God chose him. So either way, God picked Shamgar. Once again, this is another example where I cannot be 100% sure. Anath, Shamgar, I'll put it this way. I'll give you this little tidbit. So I look at another map for the Judges, and Shamgar's placed all the way up to Asher's territory. And I say, well, where did they get that from? Because he's fighting the Philistines. Well, the reason why his number is all the way up there is because there's a town in Asher called Beth-Anath. Beit-Anath. So because they don't like and are very uncomfortable with the fact that maybe his clan was named after a Canaanite god, so the explanation is, well, he judged in Asher. So they put his name all the way up in Asher. Well, what was he doing all the way up in Asher? Fighting the Philistines. So, I like I said, I can't be dogmatic with a lot of these things. But it seems like his name, like the guess is that it's a Hurrian name, which is an ancient name. Sounds like a local Canaanite name. Sounds like a mixed name. We're going to see in these Judges a mixed bag of personal shortcomings and character flaws, which frankly leaves you scratching your head and wondering why God picked them at all. Until you humble yourself and wonder how God uses us with all of our flaws. It's really what I get from verse 31. Shamgar's weapon of choice was an ox goad, which is an 8 or 9 foot long wooden pole with a sharp point. And it was much like a spear. It was used to train oxen. So he killed 600 Philistines with this weapon. So the question about Shamgar's story is why? Why use an ox goad? Does anybody know? It's a very long pole, like a big spear, and it was used to train oxen. And it had a sharp point, so it could be used as a weapon. Matter of fact, if you're good with it, like Shamgar was, apparently, God given his strength, it's a very dangerous weapon. Used like a spear. So that was his weapon of choice. Killed 600 Philistines. Why? Does anybody know the answer? That's double gold star question. Anybody know why he would use an ox goad? Good guess. Who does he sound like? Samson, right? Who killed Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. So were Samson and Shamgar both maybe Danite show-offs? We certainly don't know what tribe Shamgar's from. It doesn't say, but maybe he's a Danite show-off, just like Samson. They like to show off. Shamgar used an ox goad. Samson used the jawbone of a donkey. What do you think? No. Actually, the Philistine method of subjugation was to disarm and to ban all weapons and to manage the use of metal in their conquered territories. All right? We can read. So I want to take a look at, before we end tonight, 1 Samuel chapter 13, and I'm just going to read verses 15 through 23. So we'll turn to 1 Samuel. So obviously this is the period after the Judges, but it's early on, during Saul's rule. 13. First Samuel chapter 13, I'm going to start reading in verse 15. So just to give you a little background, they are going to war against the Philistines. The Philistines are on one side, the Israelites are on the other side. It says this, Then Samuel rose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. And the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company toward Oprah, to the land of Shual, and another company turned to Beth Horon, and another company turned toward the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan, and the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So what we find in the battle early on in 1 Samuel was that there was no weapons. Very few had weapons. Jonathan and Saul had weapons. Some of probably his royal bodyguard had weapons. But the people had no weapons. As a matter of fact, it was so bad, the Philistines took away sharpening instruments from them. So they couldn't sharp a hoe or an axe or any of their instruments that you use for their fields. They couldn't sharpen them. They had to go down to the Philistines and pay to get those instruments sharpened. Now, let me give you one guess. Why do you think they may have done that? Yeah, why do you think that they said not only we're going to make them come down, we're going to regulate even their weapons, even their instruments, their farming equipment, right?
So they couldn't use those weapons against them.
They couldn't use those weapons against them. Like who? I mean, it's only a guess, but I'm trying to guess that Shamgar taught him a lesson. Samson was another beast altogether. I mean, he could just rip off the jawbone of a donkey and start wrecking shop. But I'm sure that in their minds, Shamgar Samuel, they were still very dangerous. So they learned their lesson, right?
That's why private citizens should have their own protection.
Right. Private citizens should be able to, they have the right to protect themselves, right? Yeah, so it looks like, I mean, that was something that the Philistines did. So the Lord was with Shamgar, and he used the ox goad instead. All right? And he also saved Israel with it. Now, I just want to just close with this that I put at the bottom, God uses anyone. Othniel probably lived in the shadow of his big brother, Caleb, who was nothing short of a legend. And he probably was always in the shadow of his brother. Ehud couldn't have been very old, which shows a complete lack of military experience. And Shamgar has a very circumspect background, possibly a very mixed background. Yet each one of our judges were used of God. And I want to say this again because it's going to be a part of what we study as we move into this, into this book, the farther we go in. God is going to use imperfect people with all kinds of character flaws. But yet God's going to raise them up, going to give them power, and he's going to use them to deliver his people. This is not going to be the last time we see a couple of characters with some minor flaws and some other things that are going on that the Lord's going to use in a mighty way. This is just the beginning. So if God can use them, yeah, that's a great way of ending tonight. If God can use them, why are you giving God excuses by not being used by him today? Stop giving God excuses. Get out there, right? Get out there and serve. And, with this group of characters that we're going to be studying, we all have hope. Does anybody have any questions as far as what they read, maybe something they didn't ask, or anything that I went over? Are you talking about the Israelites? Yeah, it's a battle, right? We're not too far from that either. And that's why I said earlier, look, they were experiencing holy war, ordained by God to drive the Canaanites out. This was God-led war. And so they didn't expel all of the Canaanites, so he's going to use judges, right? And so we have a holy war as well. We have a war and a battle. And I think in America it's going to get ugly, maybe sooner rather than later. And we're going to have to take a stand. But the Lord's got us, just like he has these judges. All right, let's close in prayer.
In 12 it says, now the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight
Again.
of the Lord. Again did evil. They forget the God and they start worshiping idolatry and how
It's the cycles. The cycle continues, right?
Yeah, after each judge, like when Othniel passed, that was then. Then when Ehud,
Right.
know what I mean? And how you said it took them longer. It was only 8 years after Ehud, right? And then 80 years.
Right. They had 80 years of peace after Ehud, defeated the Moabites. Yeah, those central tribes had 80 years peace, which is why, Shamgar was delivering, let's say, Dan or delivering Judah, was why he may have been a contemporary of Ehud. If you take all of the dates and you put them back to back in a chronology like that, the period becomes way too long. So his exploits occurred after Ehud's exploits, but before Deborah and Barak, because they're going to mention Shamgar. So. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Thank you for your kind attention. And let's go to God and thank him for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for your word. Just thank you for all the hearts and minds who are here to go through the book of Judges with me tonight. Thank you for just giving us an example that we can follow as we learn the good and the bad of the people of this time period, Lord. Just pray that your word will be in our hearts throughout the next several weeks. I just pray that your guidance, your protection, and your love will be felt through these holidays. Help us keep in mind that you're the reason for the season in all things, Lord. And I just pray that you bless each one of these who are going out tonight. Just keep them protected on the road, Lord. Thanks again for your word, and just thank you for the study that we have on Thursday nights. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.